Woke up, it was a Chelsea morning, and the first thing I did was get set for my interview with the woman who made that song famous, the incomparable Judy Collins. Judy Collins has been performing her entire life, and with Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger, she pioneered the mid-20th century folk movement, singing with a voice described as liquid silver.
Both sides now, give and take and steal somehow.
She's recorded 50 albums, the latest the Lennon-McCartney collection. She's won 2 Grammys and does 60 concerts a year. To meet Judy, we headed to New York's gracious Upper West Side and the great singer's home. So this has been home for quite a while.
It's been home for about half my life.
Well, yeah, that's good. Well, it shows it. It's filled with wonderful things. Those wonderful things include Tiffany lamps and glass collectibles, a piano laden with family photos, gold records, some photos of notable family friends, and career mementos. We go back
A long time.
There have been a few decades in between.
Yes.
You know.
But it seems like yesterday, doesn't it?
it does in a way.
Seems like this morning, actually.
I like it. I like it when you say in your shows that, you know, if you remember the 60s, you weren't there. It's a good line. But there's really a lot.
David Crosby's line, I think, or maybe Mies van der Rohe. Who knows? Anyway.
Yeah. But it's a terrific line. And if you really look back at that time, singers were really activists, weren't they?
We're always activists. First of all, we're writing about feelings, and we're writing about life, and we're singing about what's really going on in our lives. Mm-hmm. And for me, politics begins with our personal lives and then goes outward. So it doesn't just arrive fully cooked in the outward life. It's part of what we do. It's the things we give money to, the things we protest against, the ideas that we care about, the letters we write, the people we support, who we vote for. Oh, yes, by the way, who we vote for.
It's a big year on that. But, in terms of that activism in the 60s, if you had to make a snapshot of 1 or 2 moments, is there any things that just stand out, like in a stream of consciousness?
Of course there were some moments that were priceless. First of all, testifying at the trial of Chicago 7 stands out. Of course it would, because I was asked to sing. Kunstler said, the judge said, why don't you tell us what you did at this yippee press conference in New York?
Right.
And I sang a bar or two of, where have all the flowers gone? And the guard rushed up and put his hands over my mouth and stopped me. And in my memory, this is where, of course, the memory fails you. I thought that was it. I always thought for decades, well, that was it. That's all that happened. Then they led me out of the courtroom. Then I read the testimony, the rest of the testimony.
What you did.
Online. I went on talking.
Wow.
He said, well, you can read the lyrics.
But
so I
can't
read
sing.
the lyrics, and then I talked a lot. But my memory went off right like that. As soon as I stopped singing, it was as if I wasn't there. That's sort of true of me anyway.
Well, that's a selective memory. I think we all can identify with that. But I really want to go back to the beginning of your musical gift. I mean, you were a prodigy on the piano, playing when you were age 3. You probably, in my opinion, could have excelled in any kind of music. You then picked up the guitar a little bit later on. What led you to folk music? Of all the different kinds of music in the world, why folk?
The stories.
Stories.
There weren't any stories. The Great American Songbook is wonderful. Don't misunderstand me. I love it. I love the songs. I grew up on them. My father sang them beautifully and paid all the bills and for the music lessons. Yeah. But there weren't any stories, really. And when I started to hear the stories, the Gypsy Rover, Barbara Allen, This Land Is Your Land, it just got me. And I had to have stories. I think also I was raised on books. I was raised on either reading them myself or being read to. And in our family, if you hadn't read Moby Dick by the time you were 9, we thought there was something wrong with your brain. And I think that connected, the stories connected. You wanted to hear about people. Also, suddenly we were breaking the rules. I was reading the introduction to Joe Boyd's book about the 60s in England. He's an English guy, and he said the 60s started in 56 and ended in 74. Agreed. I would have said, and actually from my experience, that's exactly right.
Yes.
maybe even 55 for me, because that's when I start, 55, 54, that's when I started hearing the songs.
Well, it's interesting, both that as well as rock and roll and the youth culture started in the 55 or 56.
Yeah,
Prior to that, there was really no youth culture
No,
absorbing things.
no. Well,
like-
we were too tight,
Yeah.
tight wound with the 50s. The 50s had us by the throat, and we really didn't. That's why probably when it came time for me to get a job at Michael's Pub, which was my first professional job, I had already been singing folk songs. I even won a contest in 1956. I always say that you're looking at the American Idol of 1956, because at Kiwanis clubs, the 4 state Kiwanis clubs had a big contest in Denver. They're still holding these contests, by the way, and sending people that win to Atlantic City to sing. And I was standing up there in my little short skirt with my slip showing, singing Pretty Sorrow at the convention hall in Central City, where the Miss America pageant is held. And I was 16, and it was 56. And so you're right. And on the radio, on our radio in Denver, we had all kinds of things going on. We had the Weavers going on. We had Harry Belafonte and the Kingston Trio, and I was buying records of Cynthia Gooding and Josh White and learning all the old English and Irish folk songs. And they said, "Why did you learn and sing all those work songs about whales and being on board ships?"
And sailors.
And sailors. I loved those work songs.
Now, the times I've heard you sing, going back to the initial thing, the 60s, as well as most recently across town at the Cafe Carlisle, your voice to me is a stunning and mesmerizing instrument. And I am not saying that because I'm interviewing you. I've told everybody I know, you must hear Judy Collins' voice. When did you first realize that you were this incredible gift?
Well, first of all, you have to carry a tune, and I could do that. And I loved all the songs, and I could learn them by ear, and I could do that, which really upset my teacher, because she wanted me to play Mozart without knowing what was coming next.
Right.
So when I began to sing folk songs, I didn't think of myself as a singer at all. First of all, Joan Baez was out there. I mean, compared to Joan Baez, I sounded like, somebody from down at the corner bar, with a very deep voice. If you hear my first record, I am a man. That's where the voice was.
But
so
it
I didn't
came
think
up
of myself
into the
as.
head,
But then I
into head
found a
tone.
great teacher.
Yeah. Voice teachers.
I found a great voice teacher.
You have said that you have to perform as you do, and you do a lot of concerts every year and so forth. You have to live like an athlete.
Well, you do.
Tell me a little bit about your routine, the do's and don'ts, and what you do so you can hit the mark when you need to hit the mark.
I exercise regularly, for the most part 5 times a week, maybe 6, maybe 4.
What do you do?
Well, I run. I
Right.
have a treadmill and a bike here at the apartment, but in the hotel rooms, I run around the apartment, around the hotel
Around
room.
the whole room itself?
Around the room, watching
You
my
run around
favorite
the
shows.
room?
I run around the room. You have to make it
Have
accessible.
you ever crashed into the bed or anything? Hopefully they're giving you pretty large
maybe.
rooms.
Well, you can do a lot with a small space. I could
good.
run in here very easily. You don't have to run fast.
No.
You
go
just
up
have
and down.
to do
go
it
up and down, yeah.
steadily. Then I have the Jane Fonda routine, which I learned years ago. One or another of those things, whether it was the Royal Canadian Air Force exercises, which I started in the late 60s, and because of those I had to quit smoking because I couldn't breathe. The swimming, I swam for years every day, and then I started to get sick from whatever the bugs or the swimming. So I don't swim as much anymore. But I swim, or I do Jane Fonda, or I run, or I'm on the treadmill or on the bike, and then I do the series of stretches after the running.
And vocalizing, I would imagine.
I don't necessarily sing every day.
Right.
But I know what to do when I'm going to sing.
Mm-hmm.
And 32 years of studying with Max Margulies was very, very helpful.
Good.
I try to write in my journal. I try to meditate every day. I try to read my books of various kinds on positive thinking, on whether it's Emmett Fox. I read a lot of Emmett Fox. I also keep a couple of heavyweight books in my morning reading. And I'll tell you what they are right now. Right now I'm in the middle of Paradise Lost, which I never read. I don't think even a high school student I read that.
Milton.
And then I also am reading a great book on the life of Emerson by Robert Richardson. Robert Richardson is a fantastic writer. I can't say enough about him. He wrote a great book on William James, which I read last year, called a terrible title.
You're making
William
me feel
James and the Maelstrom of American Modernism. That's too much. Mind on Fire is a much better title.
I was about to say, you're making me feel like a lightweight. The last book I read was on Tom Cruise, but it was.
I've read books on Tom Cruise.
It was an interesting
That's for
book.
later on in the day. That's all.
Let's talk about some of the lyrics of some of the songs that, over the years, maybe you've sung them 30 years or 40 years, that have changed in their meaning for you. Like your classic song, "Both Sides Now." What is there when you sing "Both Sides Now" that's substantially different for you in the meaning of the lyric than it was when you first started singing?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing.
Not even there's something lost and something gained
Nothing.
in living every day?
When you're born, you know those things. When you're 3 years old, you know those things. When you're 10, you know those things. You know about loss.
Yeah.
You know about life. I think that's probably a prerequisite for doing what we do. You know something about what it is that attracts you. So if it attracts me when I'm 20, you can believe that when I'm 60, it'll be attractive as well.
But nothing different in the interpretation of the song over 40 years, for you, the meaning.
I have been taught, and I believe this is true, that the clarity of the lyrics and the attention to the phrasing is all that I have to think about.
Right. Well, that's great singing, because
That's
you
all
have
I
the
have to
voice
think
behind
about.
it.
Whatever else is going on in my mind. People used to say, I think Lillian Gish probably used to say, I can do the marketing when I'm doing my part. I can be thinking of whether I'm going to go down to the store and get the avocados or the peaches. You can do that. There's no doubt of that. But the focus on the lyric and the phrasing is what takes you where you're supposed to. I've heard a lot and thought a lot about method acting. What happens when you're a singer is that's happening automatically because you're going all those places. I go all kinds of places when I sing. But it has nothing to do with interpretation. It has to do with the heart. It has to do with what's coming through singing. A great singer named Yvette Gilbert who sang, she was the model with the black gloves for those wonderful posters. And she became a kind of a student and a writer and studied folk music and wrote a lot about it. But she wrote a book on singing in which she just talks about what a joy it is to sing, what a privilege, how much of a celebration it is to be able to sing. That's the way I feel every time I sing.
That's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. When you're on stage singing a truly transporting song like Amazing Grace, the audience is with you, you're sending it out to them, they're sending something back to you. Can you in any way describe what that feels like?
Well, you were asking about some of the high points. I think one of the great high points of my career has been singing Amazing Grace in quite remarkable places. Certainly at Albert Hall in England after I recorded it. Certainly at the Peace March in 1968. And there have been many places where it's been. I sang it in Sarajevo, in Dubrovnik at the old church during the war in 1994. And there was a children's choir. I was there for UNICEF, and we sang Amazing Grace together. It's a transporting song. And it doesn't matter where you sing it or who it is, although you can tell your audience. I mean, there are certain northeast audiences who sing it like mad. They've been singing in choirs. They're going to go to church tomorrow. They know how to harmonize. In Oklahoma, we sang at we were at the Woody Guthrie Festival the other night and this summer, and the audience they sang like angels. It's wonderful to get an audience that really knows how to sing, although just the melody is also fine.
You recently recorded a Lennon-McCartney album, and the New York Post wrote a wonderful thing about you, saying that your singing is wonderful, your writing is wonderful, and your ability to sing other people's material is really outstanding, which does not apply to all artists. Tell me a little bit about what drew you to the Lennon-McCartney project.
I made my reputation on singing other people's songs, whether it was Turn, 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 or whether it was Leonard Cohen, whom I discovered, or Joni Mitchell, whom I discovered before either one of them had made albums.
Yeah, you shot Joni Mitchell up to Newport I remember that story. Yeah.
Well, the story is not true as according to Us Girls, or whatever that book is called.
Girls Like Us.
However, I mean, the first thing I did was to record both sides
Yeah.
now. And the second thing I did was to put together a singer-songwriter afternoon. It wasn't an evening performance, nor was Joan Baez anywhere in attendance,
Right.
nor was her mother around. I haven't written to, what's her name, Sally Weller, I think, who wrote that book, to tell her it's not true. However, I did put that festival together, that afternoon of singer-songwriter music, because I was on the board of Newport at then, and I had to fight against George Wein and Pete Seeger and the ever-present Peter Yarrow to get this thing going, even though they have written songs.
And you
Pete
you
always
believed
wrote
in
songs.
that. You
But
believed
I
in Joni.
believed
You
in-
believed in that song.
I believed in these singer-songwriters so much. So on that afternoon, which I spent the whole year working on getting going, there was Leonard Cohen. Of course, there was Joni Mitchell. I had known Leonard and recorded him a year and a half before, but I had just met and recorded Joni's music. There was Janis Ian, of whom I've always been a great fan, Tom Paxton, whom I love. So there was a little gaggle of really good singer-songwriters.
Each with a special kind of message. But
And
to
I'm
get back to Lennon and McCartney,
Yes.
what drew you to their material?
Well, again, I've looked always. I'm always looking for new songs by new writers that I
Right.
love. If I fall in love with a song, then I'm going to sing it, pretty much guaranteed.
Right.
And so all along, as I started writing my own songs, I've also always looked for other material to sing. I've done an album of all of Leonard's music.
Leonard Cohen.
I've done an album of Dylan songs, and I was looking for the next focus on a writer or writers.
Well, the
and
Lennon
Lennon McCartney songs are so great. You know, I always wanted
really
to sing
good.
them,
It's
and
really
I never
good.
did. I held off until now.
You know, if you could do this, I like to ask questions sometimes in this way. Just a sketch. I'm going to mention a couple names of people. Just what comes to mind, the essence of that person. So let's start with McCartney. You know Paul.
Oh, well, he's
just
a doll.
the quick essence of Paul.
He's a doll. He was married to Linda, of course, who was a
Friend of yours.
And he's a generous, lovely, darling man. And I appreciate his friendship, and I appreciate his art. I think he's always been a great artist.
Dylan.
Ah, the father of it all. He says that he came and sat at my feet in Central City, which I guess he did, but you know how the memory is. And one night I went up with Al Aronowitz, a great writer from the 60s. We went to Al Grossman's house to have dinner one night up in Woodstock. And I was staying over, so I was asleep upstairs. And in the middle of the night, I woke up. I heard this voice singing, and I made my way down these stone steps to the basement. And in a closed door in the basement was Dylan going over and over and over, "Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me." He was learning the song that he had just
They had
written.
just written. Well, I'll give you another one. How about Stephen Sondheim,
Oh,
composer of Send in the Clowns, one of the great recordings of your career.
it was 1973 or maybe 72, and my friend Nancy Bacall, who is my close friend, who is also one of Leonard Cohen's best friends, and we were introduced when I met Leonard in 1966, maybe before that. And Nancy called me and said, "There's a song I want you to listen to." Then Ann Pertil, who was the A&R person from Elektra, called me too, same week. And they said, "You've got to hear this song." And I said, okay. They sent the album over. I put the needle on the track. I played the record of Send in the Clowns. I said, "Oh my God!" I looked at the album, and it said Hal Prince. So I called Hal Prince, and it was 1972. So I had had a hit single. So he returned my call.
That's good.
And I said, "You know, you've got a great song in this show." And he said, "Yes, I know. It's been out 2 years, the show." And he said about 200 people have recorded it, including Sinatra.
Right.
I said, "I don't care." And then I called Jonathan Tunick and lined him up to do the orchestration. And then I called David Geffen and said I desperately wanted Arif Mardin to produce this album for me, and Phil Ramone to be the engineer. That was a
That's
one-time
an all-star
deal.
team.
It's an all-star team. You know, I think it was the last time that Phil Ramone ever performed only as an engineer. So I had all the material together except Buddy, Can You Spare a Dime, which Latifah, Arif's wife, thought of, and Salt of the Earth, which Arif came up with. Everything else I had planned. In fact, I wanted Arif because I'd written a song called Song for Duke about Duke Ellington, and I wanted him to produce it. And David Geffen organized that because Arif produced for Atlantic and all those artists on Atlantic, and he was busy. But David managed to get him on my team.
Isn't it queer losing my timing this late in my career? But where are the clouds? There ought to be clouds. Well, maybe next year.
What was there, just quickly, about Send in the Clowns that grabbed you?
The English
story?
horn.
The story.
Da, 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 da. I think that's why Sinatra didn't have the hit, because Riddle did something else to that orchestration. He didn't do da 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 on the English horn. That's, to me, and of course the voice and the English horn, my voice and the English horn, and the lyric and the story, and it's obviously an ironic song.
Very, very ironic.
And
Losing my
also,
timing this late in my career.
What lines in that song?
Yeah. Sinatra's performance in concert was very, very good. You know, the acting.
Well, of course, he's wonderful, but he didn't have those things that I knew.
The orchestration.
I knew that orchestration of Jonathan's. By the way, every note that Sondheim writes for all of these songs is in his piano transcript. When he writes the song, it's all there. Ba da da da. Jonathan.
You got to hit
It's
those.
Jonathan who takes it and says, "I want the English horn to do this," but everything in there is Sondheim. I have a note from Stephen saying, "Thanks for my hit, my first hit single," and by the way, his only hit single.
That's good.
Which is nice.
I want to move to, you know, another road, another actually more serious aspect. In your life, you battled bitter divorce and custody and lost the custody thing, which was devastating, alcoholism and the suicide of your son. You're sitting here with this behind you. What has enabled you to be able to not fold based on what hit you and hit you and hit you, and come back and live and prevail in the way that you have?
You know, I met a woman last night who lost a son in Tower 1 on 9/11, and we talked about this because it's never behind you. First of all, it's never behind you. Suicide, or the kind of loss, perhaps it's also the loss of a child, but in our case, it's the suicide and the death by suicide of somebody who was just, you know, the light of my life. It's never behind you. But I have a lot of tools. I've learned a lot of things.
That's what I was wondering. For somebody who's watching now who is battling one of those things, just a couple of the tools that they could work with and work on that could help them. Just quickly.
Don't stop talking about it, even when people say, "Oh, so is she going to go into that again? I don't want to hear about that again."
Let it out.
Let people go in your life who don't want to hear about it. And turn your attention to helping other people if you can. Do as much writing as you can. Writing is very healing. Get a meditation into your life of some kind, whether it's exercise, standing, fly fishing, formal meditations. Try to stay away from medications. Because they do dull the process and they leave you less able to go through things. You may, if you medicate, you may put off the grieving for a long time. Get into your life. Joan Rivers called me after Clark's death and she said, "You can't stop working." And I was completely
you were down.
determined.
You were losing weight.
I was in a terrible state. And I determined I was going to stop working. That was it. And she said, "You can't do that, because if you do that, you won't go through this and you won't heal." So I continued my commitments on the road. My mother came out with me and traveled. My sister with one of her kids when they were babies came out with me. My husband met me up in Montana. We traveled together. It was very important for me to be able to do that, to go through the music and through the work and do the thing that had always helped me, which was singing, writing, reading, writing songs. I eventually wrote a lot of songs in those first couple of years, which took me years to record them or sing them.
No, I read the book, and there's something I made a note that I wanted to read that really jumped out at me. You said that faith, by the way, the book is Sanity and Grace, your book about your son's suicide. You say, faith has become my teacher, and death and the loss and the sound of pounding waves and the pounding of blood in my own veins, singing to me that living fully and completely is the only way to travel from this darkness to the blazing light. Mm-hmm. That really hit me, living fully, because one would be punishing oneself to say, I can't really ever enjoy life again, wouldn't they?
Of course. If there's any revenge or any fulfillment to be had from this, you have to determine that you're going to live fully. Sometimes people put it in the way of many philosophers and writers and people who've gone through grief, that you're living for two people. You're living a double life. You're living the life that was lost as well as your own. And you owe it to yourself, but you owe it to the person who's gone and everybody in your life to see if you can't figure out how to live as fully as possible. And suicide particularly is this huge taboo. You see, I think that's a political act. I think deciding to live through fully after a suicide and to punch through that taboo and to rip the shades from across the lighted room you live in, and to say, I'm not going to, this doesn't work for me. I am not going to close my life down because suicide is a taboo, and for centuries they've been punishing suicides and their survivors. Mm-hmm. I cannot let that stop me. It's interesting that when Clark died 16 years ago, there wasn't much at all about suicide in bookstores. You couldn't find anything except The Savage God and Iris Bolton's book called My Son, My Son. She became a good friend of mine, and I would call her at 3 in the morning and she'd talk to me for a couple hours. I mean, she was a great help to me. But there wasn't anything else. And now the bookstores are filled with writing about this because people have finally come out of the closet and decided, hey, this taboo, this doesn't make any sense. It might have made sense in the time of Augustine, who did us the bad turn of condemning the suicide. But otherwise, this doesn't have there's no place to put this except into living a full life.
One of the things that I read in the book that really also jumped out at me was the quote, a death leaves a skeleton in every closet, a suicide leaves a skeleton in your closet.
Yeah,
it's quite a quote.
It's quite a slice across the psyche, isn't it?
Let me move on to something else, which fascinates me. It's also the other side here, that you have lived a totally creative life. You've established, you've earned a lot of money, you live very nicely, you've had many awards. No, you have. But you've lived
yes, I have.
all based on exploring your creativity and using your creativity. And you've written a book about creativity. What do you say to the person who's watching, who's got the gift, and they're partway down the road, but, the car's sputtering a little bit. They're starting to think, well, maybe I should give up on this. But they know inside they've got it. How do you keep the juices flowing, and how do you keep things new?
The secret to, I think, a creative person's life, and other people may think differently, is the journal. There's the energy that's always going outward. I think in my 30s I was struggling all the time to maintain my right to be a creative person. It was very hard because in the decade that I came to age in, even though there was all this frothing, marvelous creativity going on around us, there was still a good deal of sexism, there was a good deal of prejudice against women doing things. And there was certainly prejudice against, all these guys always had somebody to help out. They always did. They had a wife, they had a girlfriend, they had a number of girlfriends, they had groupies. it was a different thing for us, and we were creating the women who continue to create. And you have to then always revert to reading Simone de Beauvoir and going back as far as some of the nuns who managed to get educated and do some writing in the 11th, 12th, 13th century. You always have to find models. The main thing that I think is writing.
Writing as
in
a
the
release.
journal,
Writing
your
in your
dreams,
journal
writing
every
your
day.
daily experiences, letting it all hang out, and not writing for publication, but writing for yourself. I think that's a tremendously underrated secret.
Yeah. I keep
My
a journal.
friend Julia Cameron, who wrote The Artist's Way, is all about that and believes that is the sculpting tool of finding out what it is you want to do, of finding a way, when you find out what it is you want to do, how to find it, what to do. The journal serves all kinds of purposes, and I think it's fundamental. I really do.
The only thing that I could take, also, there's a lot I can take from what you just said, but are you saying you never had a groupie? You've had groupies. I mean, the guys had groupies. You must have had some. I mean,
You don't want to know about my groupies.
All right.
Yeah, I had a couple.
You know, I want to ask you this: the song "Chelsea Morning."
Not to condemn rock and roll artists and their groupies. I mean, I love it. I would love to have been one. In fact, I was one.
You were a groupie for?
Well, for Stephen, of course.
Uh-huh.
A little more than a groupie, of course. But
How about the song "Chelsea Morning"? Bill and Hillary Clinton named their daughter Chelsea after that song. How did you first find out that this important family had named their child after this big hit of yours?
Well, the first thing that I found out, I met Clinton the Clintons, both of the Clintons, in 1991 when he was still governor.
Right.
They came up to Chautauqua. Hillary was doing what she's always done so well, advocating for children, among other people. She advocated for children from the very start of her work. And I was singing there, and they were there at the concert, and they came. And then I met Clinton after the first big outpouring of support for him in June of '92. And then my brother called me and said, have you read Newsweek or Time or something? Maybe it was Rolling Stone. They had done an interview with Bill Clinton, and he said, if I'm president, I'll have a parade and I'll have Judy Collins sing. He said, have you got a dress? My brother said, my brother Mike, my oldest brother.
That's great.
And he said, have you got a dress for the inauguration? And I said, why? And he said, well, if he gets in, he's going to have you sing, which he did.
Ah, wonderful.
And then he also quoted in that one of those articles around that time, they said, if your house was burning down, what album would you save? And he named Colors of the Day, which I put, and he named all the songs. I said, well, he really knows, he knows what he's talking about.
So you developed an actual friendship out of it.
Yes, well, we started to be friends. We met in Malibu, actually, in '91. My sister came up, and my niece was with me. Their photographs are here somewhere. And the baby, little tiny, I think Kaylin was about 2, maybe.
Uh-huh.
And then I sang at the inaugural, danced at the inaugural, and then began to go in and out of the White House like I lived there. I mean, on Inauguration Day, you mustn't tell anybody, but Louis and I were there, and we'd already gotten to know the Clintons, and we went into the White House. I didn't have any ID with me. It was Inauguration Day. I didn't even have my purse with me. We had a few bucks for a cab, that was it.
Uh-huh.
We walked right
Walked all over the White House? What?
And we were being interviewed by actually by Maria Shriver, and we were trying to meet her on the lawn, but we just kind of wandered in. We had a wonderful time in those years.
Well, I want to wrap things up first. I want to thank you, but since we were talking about Chelsea Morning, the first time I saw you over at the Cafe Carlisle, the show I saw.
Yeah.
You opened with that song.
Yes.
And you vaulted me all the way back to Greenwich Village in the 60s when my life was, and my career was just starting.
Oh, it's
the
very
transporting
nice.
power of music. And Judy, you've been doing it for a long time. You're going to continue to do it, I sense, for a very long time. I thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.